so large, of course, but it's on the model of the famous clock at Strasbourg. Only think, he began it when I was 8 years old, and though I was 16 last birthday, it isn't finished yet. Some of our friends were quite surprised he should take to such a thing when his troubles began. But Papa himself set that right in no time. He reminded them that Louis XVI took to lock-making when his troubles began, and then everybody was perfectly satisfied." She stopped and changed color confusedly. "Oh, Mr. Armadale," she said, in genuine embarrassment this time, "here is my unlucky tongue running away with me again. I'm talking to you already as if I had known you for years. This is what Papa's friend meant when he said my manners were too bold. It's quite true. I have a dreadful way of getting familiar with people if—" She checked herself suddenly on the brink of ending the sentence by saying, "if I like them." "No, no, do go on," pleaded Allan. "It's a fault of mine to be familiar too. Besides, we must be familiar. We are such near neighbors. I'm rather an uncultivated sort of fellow, and I don't know quite how to say it, but I want your cottage to be jolly and friendly with my house, and my house to be jolly and friendly with your cottage. There's my meaning, all in the wrong words. Do go on, Miss Milroy. Pray go on." She smiled and hesitated. "I don't exactly remember where I was," she replied. "I only remember I had something I wanted to tell you. This comes, Mr. Armadale, of my taking your arm. I should get on so much better if you would only consent to walk separately. You won't? Well, then, will you tell me what it was I wanted to say? Where was I before I went wandering off to Papa's troubles and Papa's clock?" "At school," replied Allan, with a prodigious effort of memory. "Not at school, you mean," said Miss Milroy, "and all through you. Now I can go on again, which is a great comfort. I'm quite serious, Mr. Armadale, in saying that I should have been sent to school if you had said no when Papa proposed for the cottage. This is how it happened. When we began moving in, Mrs. Blanchard sent us a most kind message from the great house to say that her servants were at our disposal, if we wanted any assistance. The least Papa and I could do after that was to call and thank her. We saw Mrs. Blanchard and Miss Blanchard. Mistress was charming, and Miss looked perfectly lovely in her mourning. I'm sure you admire her. She is tall and pale and graceful, quite your idea of beauty, I should think." "Nothing like it," began Allan. "My idea of beauty at the present moment—" Miss Milroy felt it coming and instantly took her hand off his arm. "I mean, I have never seen either Mrs. Blanchard or her niece," added Allan, precipitately correcting himself. Miss Milroy tempered justice with mercy, and put her hand back again. "How extraordinary that you should never have seen them!" she went on. "Why, you're a perfect stranger to everything and everybody at Thorpe Ambrose. Well, after Miss Blanchard and I had sat and talked a little while, I heard my name on Mrs. Blanchard's lips, and instantly held my breath. She was asking Papa if I had finished my education. Out came Papa's great grievance directly. My old governess, you must know, left us to be married just before we came here, and none of our friends could produce a new one whose terms were reasonable. I'm told, Mrs. Blanchard, by people who understand it better than I do, says Papa, that advertising is a risk. It all falls on me, in Mrs. Milroy's state of health, and I suppose I must end in sending my little girl to school. Do you happen to know of a school within the means of a poor man?" Mrs. Blanchard shook her head, and I could have kissed her on the spot for doing it. "All my experience, Major Milroy, says this perfect angel of a woman is in favor of advertising. My niece's governess was originally obtained by an advertisement, and you may imagine her value to us when I tell you she lived in our family for more than 10 years. I could have gone down on both my knees and worshipped Mrs. Blanchard then and there, and I only wonder I didn't. Papa was struck at the time, I could see that, and he referred to it again on the way home. 'Though I have been long out of the world, my dear,' says papa, 'I know a highly bred woman and a sensible woman when I see her.' Mrs. Blanchard's experience puts advertising in a new light. I must think about it." "He has thought about it, and though he hasn't openly confessed it to me, I know that he decided to advertise no later than last night. So, if papa thanks you for letting the cottage, Mr. Armadale, I thank you too. But for you, we should never have known darling Mrs. Blanchard, and but for darling Mrs. Blanchard, I should have been sent to school." Before Allan could reply, they turned the corner of the plantation and came in sight of the cottage. Description of it is needless. The civilized universe knows it already. It was the typical cottage of the drawing master's early lessons in neat shading and the broad pencil touch, with the trim thatch, the luxuriant creepers, the modest lattice windows, the rustic porch, and the wicker birdcage, all complete. "Isn't it lovely?" said Miss Milroy. "Do come in." "May I?" asked Allan. "Won't the Major think it too early?" "Early or late, I'm sure papa will be only too glad to see you." She led the way briskly up the garden path and opened the parlor door. As Allan followed her into the little room, he saw at the further end of it a gentleman sitting alone at an old-fashioned writing table, with his back turned to his visitor. "Papa's surprise for you," said Miss Milroy, rousing him from his occupation. "Mr. Armadale has come to Thorpe Ambrose, and I have brought him here to see you." The Major started, rose, bewildered for the moment, recovered himself immediately, and advanced to welcome his young landlord with hospitable outstretched hand. A man with a larger experience of the world and a finer observation of humanity than Allan possessed would have seen the story of Major Milroy's life written in Major Milroy's face. The home troubles that had struck him were plainly betrayed in his stooping figure and his wan, deeply wrinkled cheeks, when he first showed himself on rising from his chair. The changeless influence of one monotonous pursuit and one monotonous habit of thought were next expressed in the dull, dreamy self-absorption of his manner and his look while his daughter was speaking to him. The moment after, when he had roused himself to welcome his guest, was the moment which made the self-revelation complete. Then there flickered in the Major's weary eyes a faint reflection of the spirit of his happier youth. Then there passed over the Major's dull and dreamy manner a change which told unmistakably of social graces and accomplishments, learned at some past time in no ignoble social school. A man who had long since taken his patient refuge from trouble in his own mechanical pursuit. A man only roused at intervals to know himself again for what he once had been. So revealed to all eyes that could read him aright, Major Milroy now stood before Allan, on the first morning of an acquaintance which was destined to be an event in Allan's life. "I'm heartily glad to see you, Mr. Armadale," he said, speaking in the changeless, quiet, subdued, tone peculiar to most men whose occupations are of the solitary and monotonous kind.